Good evening, everyone. Welcome to CPD's first ever community conversation on one of their policies. Tonight's policy is going to be on foot pursuits. My name is Marcia Thompson. I'm going to be your moderator. Before we get started with this conversation, I'd like to do a couple of housekeeping. One, this conversation is being recorded. It will be posted on the CPD Reform site for others who were not able to attend tonight, but also if you have other questions and you'd like to rewatch it and send us follow-up questions. Additionally from that, we will have 3 panelists this evening that will talk about how we got to this point with the policy, where the policy stands currently, and then how you can continue to be involved in this conversation moving forward. We will additionally will have the superintendent giving welcome remarks in just a moment. And then also we'll have an opportunity after the 3 panelists present for you as a community to pose a few questions to the panelists. I would ask that you put your questions in the chat. And when you pose your question, please add the name of the panelist that you would like to answer those questions. And again, you will meet the 3 panelists here shortly. But before we get started with the rest of the webinar, I'd like to introduce the superintendent, David Brown, who's going to give some opening comments. Superintendent.
Thank you, Marcia. I first want to thank all of you for attending this webinar tonight. This is the first time, as Marcia mentioned, the Chicago Police Department has ever done a webinar like this, and I hope it provides a new opportunity to share with the public some of the work we are doing and the reforms we are implementing. I also hope webinars like these will provide a new way for the public to ask questions of us and provide your feedback as we continue our reform efforts. Tonight, we're going to share with you the new interim foot pursuit policy we announced last week. This interim policy will go into effect July 11th and remain in place throughout the summer while we conduct a comprehensive community engagement plan on this policy. You will hear more about the community engagement opportunities throughout this webinar. Tonight, we will walk you through the specifics of the policy and key components within it. But I wanted to take a moment to highlight a few of those. This policy was created to protect both our officers, but also individuals engaged in foot pursuits that are fleeing from officers and other residents around during a pursuit. It requires our officers to conduct a balancing act and considerations surrounding officer and public safety before initiating a foot pursuit policy. It also outlines alternatives to a pursuit, such as setting up a perimeter to apprehend suspects as an alternative. The policy also states that foot pursuits are only appropriate when there is probable cause for arrest or a belief that an individual has committed or is about to commit a crime. So it is my hope that tonight you can learn more about what is in the actual policy and begin to provide us with your feedback on the ways to improve it. Thank you again for being here tonight, and I'm going to turn it back over to Marcia.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. All right, so we're going to continue this conversation. We really appreciate the superintendent's time. He is not going to stay with us for the entire webinar. We have our 3 panelists who are going to start this conversation with the community. As the superintendent said, this is only the beginning of this conversation, and you will have time throughout the next few months to engage on this policy, and we'll have more opportunities to discuss what that would look like as we go through this webinar tonight. But our first panelist to talk to you about kind of the history and the background of this webinar is going to be Executive Director Boyk, who's going to talk to you about where this policy came from and how we got to this point. So Executive Director Boyk, welcome.
Thank you, Marcia. So I would like to start just by talking a little bit about where the foot pursuit policy comes from. In 2016, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, came into Chicago and conducted a review of the Chicago Police Department. That ultimately led to a report that they produced right around the time of the change in administration from President Obama to President Trump. One of the main items that was mentioned in that report was the issue of foot pursuits. And what the DOJ stated in their report, and they cited numerous examples, was that Chicago had a history of engaging in dangerous foot pursuits. So as a result of that, the city of Chicago negotiated what is known as a consent decree with the Office of the Attorney General for the state of Illinois. And a consent decree is really just a legal settlement document that articulates a number of items that the department needs to address over the course of time. One of the issues, obviously, as a result of the DOJ report that was addressed in the consent decree is the issue of foot pursuits. And what the language of the consent decree said was a couple things. One, that CPD would put together a training bulletin and conduct training with officers with respect to foot pursuits. The other item that was mentioned in the consent decree is that over time, data would be reviewed. And as a result of that data review, the independent monitor would make recommendations at a later date with respect to whether CPD needed a foot pursuit policy. On March 5th of this year, CPD did receive that recommendation from the independent monitor. And that recommendation stated that, in fact, CPD should adopt a foot pursuit policy. So since that time, we have been engaged in an extensive research around what best practices are around the country. And we have come up with the draft policy that we are discussing today. Now, this policy is referred to, and the superintendent referred to it as an interim policy. So the policy that is now public will be in place until early September. But this is really the starting point. And it's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation tonight, really to begin the conversation with the community so that we can have a policy that is truly reflective of what the community in Chicago desires. We have also, in the interim process, engaged our own staff, our officers, to get their input on what they wanted to see in a foot pursuit policy, as well as we have begun some targeted engagement with members of the community. That engagement is going to ramp up significantly in the months ahead, which we will address later in the webinar. So that's a short version of the history here. In September, we hope to accomplish a longer term policy, and that will be based on the feedback that comes through this process, as well as the additional conversations that we're going to have throughout the city of Chicago between now and July 15th.
Executive Director, you mentioned something about the independent monitor. How do they stay involved in this process? You mentioned they suggested that this policy in March be part of your consent decree, but do they stay involved in this process as far as the engagement or the finalization of it? How does that work?
So the independent monitor is really an arm of the federal court. So this consent decree is overseen by a federal judge, and the monitor acts on behalf of the court to oversee the implementation of the consent decree. So that gives the monitor certain rights. And with respect to the language around foot pursuits, actually both the monitor and the Office of the Attorney General have to approve the final version of the policy that we hope will go into effect in early September. So we have had some preliminary conversations with the Office of the Attorney General as well as with the monitor, and those conversations will be ongoing throughout the summer months, as they will also be ongoing with the community.
So in terms of research and additional input, you mentioned that you're looking at best practices, and then you're also looking at what the community's feedback will be throughout this process. Then at that point, you will add some language potentially to the policy. Will that then go back to the independent monitor for review again?
Yes, it will. So what we've put out right now is really our first attempt. And we thought it was critically important because, as the superintendent mentioned, this is a safety issue. It's a safety issue for members of the community, for those engaging in foot pursuits, whether that be the officer or the individual who's fleeing from the officer. So it is very much a safety issue. And so as a result of that, we thought it important to have an interim policy in place through the summer months while we work on that longer term policy with the community. But Marcia, you're absolutely correct that ultimately the monitor and the attorney general will have to approve the policy that is ultimately developed through the summer months.
Okay, thank you, Executive Director. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I go into someone telling us a little more about the actual policy?
No, we'll keep going, and I look forward to the questions later on in the meeting.
Thank you so much, sir. All right, our next speaker is going to be Lieutenant Kapistanik, who's going to talk to us about the actual policy, the interim policy and where it stands, and going to highlight some of the language in the policy. So Lieutenant Kapistanik.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Kapistanik. I've been with Sworn Police Officer for the Chicago Police Department for 22 years. I'm currently a lieutenant in the Research and Development Division, commanding officer of the Policy and Procedure Section. So tonight I'm going to go through the content of the interim policy that was announced last week. Basically, we'll provide an overview of two key components broken down into two sections. The pre-pursuit considerations we want our officers to consider, and then what we want our officers to do during a foot pursuit.
Lieutenant, before you start that, I see you're going to have a slide presentation here, but before you do that, could I ask you one question kind of to follow up on what the superintendent said and then also what the executive director said?
Absolutely.
What, if any, community input have you had already on this policy? And how does community input inform the policy revisions that you make?
We've done various mechanisms through not only community input, but also input from our officers. We've done focus groups with our officers. We've had some conversations with some community members. So what we've done is we've looked at those comments and those conversations, and we look at every one of those comments. Each one gets consideration. What we do is we look at those comments, we look at common themes, we review them consistent with best practices, and we try to incorporate some of that language into the draft policy. What we've identified through a lot of these conversations is that sometimes what CPD is saying and what the community is saying are not that different. We're saying the same thing, it's just a different way. So by having these conversations and working with the community, we're able to frame our policy that truly reflects the expectations of the community, and it reflects the concerns that are identified via these conversations, and we're able to instruct our officers through the policy and making sure that it's framed in a way that balances what everyone needs to know and the expectations.
I appreciate that. Let me let you go through your presentation, and then I may have another question for you. Thank you.
Not a problem. So like I was saying, we'll go through two really quick segments on the policy. We'll give you a brief overview of the main components of the policy, and then as the executive director said, we'll be able to answer some questions at the end. So the first topic I want to talk about is pre-pursuit considerations. These are what we want officers to consider prior to engaging in a foot pursuit. First and foremost, and the executive director and the superintendent have highlighted this already, is that foot pursuits are inherently dangerous. They convey a risk not only to our officers, but to the person we're pursuing and to the general public at large. So the highest priority that we have is the sanctity of life. That's consistent with our other policies, and pretty much what the sanctity of life entails is that every human life on all human beings are perceived and to be treated as persons of inherent worth and dignity. So we want our officers going into any of these situations with that mindset. The second key one is that foot pursuits carry inherent risk. And as we've said before and a number of times, and you'll hear this concept repeated tonight over and over again, the primary consideration of these circumstances is safety. the officer's safety, the subject safety, and the safety of members of the public. And what we want our officers to do in these situations is to continually assess and determine what the appropriate response is in these circumstances. There are many different responses. We want officers to be able to assess and to identify and individualize these pursuits and to take considerations into play as they're making that determination whether or not to engage in a foot pursuit. Some of those safety considerations and some of those tactics that we want to use to prevent foot pursuits. We've done significant training recently in CPD on the concept of de-escalation and what we call the principles of force mitigation. What we want officers to do is we want officers to use these concepts, the concepts of continually communicating with the people that they're interacting with, to use tactical positioning as they're approaching subjects or as they're approaching people, and to use time to their advantage. Is there an opportunity to wait for additional resources? Is there an opportunity to wait for emotions to de-escalate? We want officers to use those concepts and those principles prior to even engaging or approaching the subject while engaging in a foot pursuit to prevent or to mitigate the foot pursuits from even occurring. The second thing that we want to emphasize in this policy, and the superintendent spoke to this as well, is that we want officers to consider alternatives to foot pursuits. Some alternatives can mean obtaining additional assistance from other department members, establishing a containment and surveillance area if there's not an immediate need to engage in a foot pursuit. We've talked about the technology we have cameras, we have other things we can use to identify the subjects. We even want officers to consider, is there potentially the ability to apprehend this person at a later date and time? If we've got the information of who this subject is, what the circumstances are, it might be more appropriate to apprehend the subject at a later time. We want the officers to consider these factors as they're making that determination on whether or not a foot pursuit is appropriate in these circumstances. Additionally, we want officers to consider factors that might heighten the risk of a foot pursuit. All foot pursuits are inherently or convey some inherent risk, but there are circumstances that might increase the risk. Whether the officer is acting alone, have the officers identified themselves? Are there availability of assist units around? Is the person potentially armed, or the officer knows that they're armed? What type of circumstance, what type of crime is going on? Will the crime likely be continued if the officer doesn't intervene? And then just general safety information, the nature of the area, the conditions, weather, lighting, all those conditions. We want officers to be able to identify those as they're making that assessment of whether or not the risk of a foot pursuit outweighs the need to immediately apprehend the person at that time. So that leads into the decision to pursue. So our policy identifies the specific decision to pursue and the standards that we want officers to abide by. The first, and the superintendent talked about this point, is that foot pursuits must be based on probable cause or reasonable articulable suspicion. What probable cause is we know that that person is the perpetrator of a crime. We know that that person, whether it's through documented reports, whether it's through observations, whether that officer physically observes someone, whether it's a known offender, we know that we can effect an arrest. So we know there's probable cause to arrest. Therefore, we can engage in a foot pursuit if that subject flees. The second one is reasonable articulable suspicion. And basically what that means is it's got to be more than a hunch. That officer has to have reasonable suspicion that they can articulate that either that person has committed a crime, is committing a crime, or is about to commit a crime. So that officer, it could be based on previous identification of crimes, the circumstances. That officer has to be able to articulate the specifics, not just merely a hunch that a crime is happening and that person's involved. They've got to be able to substantiate that more, whether it's a call for service or other factors that go into that decision to pursue. Not only that, but that officer's got to be able to weigh the risks with the immediate apprehension, the need to immediately apprehend that offender. So we want the officer to conduct a balancing test as they're approaching, as they're determining whether or not to engage in a foot pursuit, on whether there's an immediate need to apprehend that offender, whether it's the nature of the crime, whether it's the circumstances, whether we can, like we said, we can do alternatives later. We want that officer to balance that risk with the need to apprehend that offender. And then we have specific prohibitions. There are prohibitions on engaging in a foot pursuit for crimes that are less than a Class A misdemeanor. So your Class A misdemeanors and your felonies would be your more serious crimes that officers will be able to pursue for. We have prohibitions against traffic offenses that are mere licensing or petty violations, what would be ticketable offenses, while still giving the officers the ability to pursue for traffic offenses that would endanger or disregard the bodily safety of others or endanger people. And then there's the basic safety considerations that we prohibit foot pursuits. Did the officer not have their radio or are able to communicate with the dispatcher? Did we lose any equipment? Are we unaware of our location? Things that are specific to that, officers would not be able to pursue in those circumstances as well. So those are all the considerations we want an officer and our officers to consider prior to engaging in a foot pursuit. So now we'll go to what we have in our policy when an officer does make that decision. When they balance and they weigh those factors and they weigh the risk and they weigh the need to immediately apprehend the offender, we also have guidelines on what we want those officers and how we want those officers to conduct themselves while engaging in that foot pursuit. Basically, the pursuing officer's response, there are some immediate things we want that officer to do. We want that officer to activate that body cam. That body camera should be activated already during a law enforcement engagement as we're communicating, as we're interacting with the public. That body cam should be activated. We want to make sure that it's activated so it can capture the entire circumstance of that foot pursuit. The second thing we want officers to immediately do is notify the dispatcher to get on the radio and identify that they're in a foot pursuit. What that does is that allows us to identify where that officer is at. It lets us identify a supervisor to start monitoring that pursuit, and it allows us to assign assisting resources or other units to help that officer when they're engaged in that foot pursuit. And we've talked about the balancing test, that we want officers to assess that risk on the front before engaging in a foot pursuit. We want that officer to continuously assess during that foot pursuit. They still need to do that balancing test and weigh the risk because circumstances might change. So we want officers to consider and continually assess those circumstances as they're engaged in this pursuit. Not only are they doing this continual assessment, but there are certain things that we want officers to consider that we've identified as safety considerations for the pursuit. They need to consider their communication and coordination with their partners and other assist units. Can I effectively communicate with my partner? Do my assist units know where I am? Can I effectively communicate if I'm in need of help or if there's some interaction with the subject that I need to communicate with my fellow officers with? We need to coordinate with our partners so that we know where each other are at, so we're able to assist each other during that pursuit. So those are some things we want officers to consider. We also want officers to consider the presence of weapons, whether it's our weapons or the weapons of the subject. We want officers to consider what kind of obstacles, what kind of terrain, what kind of unanticipated risk there might be, whether they're vacant buildings, whether they're empty lots. That's all part of the assessment that we want that officer to do as they're engaging in this foot pursuit. Additionally, and we've talked about this, not only will safety be a repetitive theme here, but also be on the decision whether to pursue or whether containment or other options are available to us. So during that pursuit, we want officers to consider, is containment a better option at this point? Do we know who this offender is? Is there an area where our assist units are there where we don't need to continue to pursue for immediate apprehension, but a perimeter has been set, a containment area has been set, our technology resources are able to observe that subject on camera, and there's other alternatives that our members and our officers can consider while engaging in a foot pursuit. And then finally, when that foot pursuit is discontinued and we apprehend that subject, we want to make sure that the officers provide the medical attention that's necessary to the officer, to the person they were pursuing, and to any member of the public who might be injured at that time or claims to be injured. We want to make sure the appropriate notifications are made so that our resources know that the foot pursuit has been discontinued, so that we can properly address resources there. And we got to make sure that those officers are documenting the foot pursuit. We currently document our arrests based on probable cause and our investigatory stops based on reasonable articulable suspicion. We need to make sure our officers are continuing to document the occurrence the same way in any other reporting or documentation that they need to occur. Additionally, our policy goes very specific into what a supervisor's role is. It's a very expansive part of the policy, but to put it simply, our supervisor's role is to monitor the pursuit. And while they're monitoring that pursuit, we want them to direct and coordinate the actions to help mitigate the risk that are associated with that pursuit. They will continually assess the situation, to provide instruction to the members, to provide instructions to assist officers, to provide instructions maybe to the technology support so that we can help our officers during that foot pursuit to safely conclude that pursuit. They can also instruct our officers to hold their position if they know there's additional resources available, or if that supervisor determines and the risk outweighs the necessity or there's a safety consideration, that officer or that supervisor has the ability to discontinue a foot pursuit and instruct those officers to discontinue a foot pursuit. However, upon discontinuation of a foot pursuit, if we don't apprehend the offender or the subject, just like the executive director said, there's other actions we can take, whether it's containment, surveillance, technology. We will utilize all those resources to make sure that we can safely conclude either the apprehension or the foot pursuit at that time. And then just like what we expect our supervisors to do always, we expect supervisors to supervise their officers. We expect them to be supervisors, to be leaders in the field. So we expect them to supervise the incident appropriately. We expect them to be on scene during the resolution so that we can ensure the safety of everyone involved. And then we want to make sure our supervisors, not only our officers, but our supervisors are documenting it correctly as well so that we can provide for after-action reviews and other documentation. The policy is 12 pages long. This was a very brief overview of some of the key points in the policy. I know we're going to continue the community engagement beyond this webinar, where there's going to be not only time today, but other opportunities for to provide feedback or have questions about the policy. We look forward to participating in that engagement. Like I said before, we really appreciate the feedback and the input from the community so that we can articulate exactly what our expectations are, and we can be reflective of what the community is asking as well.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Kapistanik. I've got one question for you. But
Sure.
before I do that, for those who may not be aware, we do have an ASL interpreter on the line. So if you're not seeing our sign language interpreter, please make sure you adjust your webinar so that you can see her. She is available throughout this webinar. Lieutenant Kapistanik, you mentioned that you really appreciate the feedback from the community and that the community input informs your policy and the policy direction. Is there anything specific? I know you said there's 12 pages to this policy and you gave us, a pretty good overview in a pretty short time period. So we appreciate that. But are there specific things that you might be looking for feedback on that you can kind of give the community a head start? Is there something you would love to get their feedback on in the policy now?
Absolutely. Well, what we want to do is we want to hear from the community and from everyone what their expectations of our department are and what their expectations of our officers are. A lot of the policy gets into specifics on procedural elements on what we want officers to do, some documentation to fill out, but a lot of the core policies are up front when we're talking about the pre-pursuit considerations, when we're talking about the decision to pursue and what the prohibitions are, what the expectations of the community are in relation to when foot pursuits would probably be appropriate, and how we want our officers to react or respond prior to the pursuit and when engaging or making that determination in the pursuit. That's where we'll probably get a lot of valuable feedback and get the perspective from the community on what the expectations and what they anticipate from our officers, because then we can be reflective of what the concerns are and we can be very responsive to what the community is providing.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I go on to our next panelist?
I'm sure the good commander's waiting to get in, so.
All right, thank you so much. Our next panelist will be Commander Navalis, who's going to talk about our ongoing engagement efforts. Commander Navalis, please welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. Oh, to everybody out there, good evening. My name is Commander Angel Navalis, and I'm the commander of the Office of Community Policing. I'd like to thank everybody for attending this webinar tonight and for your interest in providing feedback on this policy. Along with this new policy, we've launched a comprehensive effort to get as much input and feedback on this policy from the community and from those who have direct experience. Between now and the 15th of July, we're offering a number of opportunities for you to be able to provide your input and recommendations to us on this policy. In addition to the webinar tonight, we've posted a policy online at the Chicago Police Department's webpage so anyone in the public can review the policy. The public also has the opportunity to submit comments on the policy at the same webpage. Additionally, we've launched a public input form where anyone could respond to a handful of questions around various concepts of the foot pursuit. Responses to the form are going to be completely anonymous. We're also inviting any community group, organization interested with meeting with CPD to sign up for what we're calling deliberative dialogue. The only way we're going to make this real, meaningful, and possible change for this department is with the help and partnership of folks out in the community. If you have any additional questions or feedback you'd like to provide, please reach out to us by emailing us. Email us at community@chicagopolice.org. Thank you again for your willingness to help inform policy, and we look forward to working with you.
Commander Navalis, before I let you go, I got one question for you. So you said that this is a comprehensive community engagement plan, and I've been working with the department for a little bit over a year, and I do see that this is definitely a step in that direction. So I really appreciate the effort that you and your department are putting into this. But how would you say this is different from something you've done in the past? What makes this particular engagement process different?
Good question. Engaging with the public on policies is still pretty new to the CPD, but we've learned a lot from our past experience. We're now trying to take everything that we learn and apply it to new concepts and efforts as we move forward. You know, we recognize the need for broader and more diverse opportunities for the public to get involved, to get engaged. So we hope to address some of that during this effort. This engagement plan is probably one of the most comprehensive plans we've put together so far. This engagement is exceptional. By offering multiple avenues for the public to engage and provide their feedback, we're making a concerted effort to reach as many people as possible. Our intent is to build a long-term sustainable model that allows for the public to always have a voice and ability to engage during our reform efforts. And it's my hope that this engagement effort will help expand our capabilities of reaching more people and getting greater feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we are at the point of Q&A, and during our three panelists. So for those of you still out there, if you want to ask questions of our panelists, you have Executive Director Boyk, Lieutenant Kapistanik, who did the policy review, and then you just heard from Commander Navalis, who talked about the ongoing community engagement efforts. One of the questions that I've already collected while you all were talking was one specifically about, are there other large cities similar to Chicago that have adopted a foot pursuit policy that you're aware of? And it wasn't directed to anybody in particular, but I would ask either Lieutenant Kapistanik or Executive Director Boyk to answer that question, because you all talked about some of the research and best practices. Do you know of other cities that have a foot pursuit policy or have adopted one recently?
Go ahead, Lieutenant.
Thank you, sir. Yes, we've done a lot of best practice research, and as the executive director said, this concept isn't new, but policies, foot pursuit policies in policing are rather new. It's probably been around for 5 or 6 years. We've looked at a lot of agencies in other large municipalities. We've looked at Dallas, Las Vegas, LA County, and LAPD. We've looked at Philadelphia. We've also looked at other consent decree cities, New Orleans, Baltimore. Some of them are older policies, some of them are rather new. Baltimore's policy just went into effect, I believe, this February. So there's still a lot of research going on these topics, and we've looked at those when we were looking at how to craft a policy specific for Chicago. So there's a bunch of other research and policies out there. The International Association of Chiefs of Police has guiding documentation as well. So we took all this into account as we were looking, to craft a policy that was reflective of what we needed here in Chicago.
There's a follow-up question on that, and again, I'll direct it to the two of you, unless Commander Navalis wants to jump in. But the question was, do you know if having this policy has had an impact, I'm assuming on decreasing officer-involved shootings, or had any impact on overall crime reduction or engagement with the community? Have any of those research or other peer agencies that you reviewed, has it showed a decline in any of those areas or an increase in engagement?
So one distinction that I do want to draw based on that question is there's a difference between a foot pursuit and engaging in a foot pursuit and a use of force incident. Actually, both events are governed by two different policies. One, obviously, now foot pursuit policy. The other is our use of force policy, which is a fairly comprehensive suite of a number of items that officers have to consider when they make a decision to use force. But more specifically to the question, we have not noticed really a substantial difference with respect to crime increasing. Certainly because of the safety issues associated with foot pursuits, we do hope that there is a difference with respect to the number of officers that become injured as a result of a foot pursuit. I believe 15% of our foot pursuits result in an officer injury. So that is something that we are hoping to combat with this policy. But again, as the superintendent mentioned, as Lieutenant Kapistanik mentioned, the number one overarching principle of this policy is safety. Safety for the officer, safety for the public, safety for the person that is being pursued.
Okay, let me follow up on something that you all talked about earlier, and I think it might have been yourself, Executive Director. You mentioned that there have been focus groups and other ways of gathering community input. One of the audience members wanted to know if the information gathered from the focus groups as well as from individual community members, would that information be offered to the public? And then also in the future engagement, maybe Commander Navalis might want to answer this, are there going to be ways to identify and validate the outcomes of those engagements? So how will the community know that you've used what they said and that what they said is being measured if it's going to be successful?
So for the engagement we've done thus far, and we're really at the beginning of the process, there are a couple of items I would point you to in the policy itself. Our community engagement specifically requested prohibitions, and this policy has a complete section on prohibitions. In other words, when can an officer not engage in a foot pursuit for a variety of circumstances? And you heard Lieutenant Kapistanik address a number of them in his presentation. So that was one area in particular. And then another piece for what we've done thus far, which really comes from officers, where they were asking for bright lines. Just please, in our focus groups with officers, tell us what we can do and what we can't do. And so we attempted to draw those distinctions in the policy itself. But again, this is really the beginning of the road with respect to community engagement. What we hope to do moving forward is obviously collect all of that input. And as Lieutenant Kapistanik mentioned, each of those points that are raised are considered in the policy development process, such that at the end of the process, we will be able to produce a document that talks about the engagement that we received and what our response was. Either we accepted those comments in whole, or we rejected it and here's why. But our intent is to be as transparent as possible with what the feedback is that we receive, as well as what our response is to that feedback.
There's one other question that people are really excited about this. Is there a limit on how many community organizations can be involved in this process?
So obviously we have limited capability here. So the directed engagement that I believe it's referred to on the website is on a first come, first served basis. We will do our absolute best to get to as many groups as possible. If the response is overwhelming, we may not get to everyone, but we will, we are committed to working as hard as we possibly can to reach as many groups as possible throughout this process. The other thing I would add, though, is we do have 2 citywide community meetings scheduled, one in June and one in July, where anyone in the city can participate. They will be virtual, obviously, because COVID, while we are making progress, is still a real thing. So anybody can participate in that. And if for some reason, the response is overwhelming and we're not able to get to everyone, that would be a great opportunity for people to engage. But in addition to that, you can send in comments at any time to that email address that I believe Commander Navalis mentioned. And Marcia, I did not write it down, so perhaps you can repeat it at the end so that everybody has it. But we will be taking comments throughout this entire process. The final thing I would add is the policy is online right now. There is a portal that you could go to and type in your comment on the policy today if you want to, but that portal will remain open for comments until July 15th.
So it sounds like July 15th is an important date for everybody to keep in mind. We're going to shift gears a little bit with some of the questions. There's been a lot of questions coming through about data and transparency on data. Is there a place already available aside from the policy itself, but is there some place where community members can go to find out the number of foot pursuits that CPD has engaged in, outcomes of foot pursuits, things like that? Is there somewhere where data is collected on foot pursuits that's available to the community now?
So we have made great strides in the last year and a half or so to be more transparent with our data, particularly around use of force incidents. Foot pursuits, however, is a new topic that, again, per the consent decree, we only recently started tracking within the last, I would say, couple of years. We are actively working right now behind the scenes to be more transparent with our data on foot pursuits, such that by the time we get to September and have a final policy, we hope to have some sort of public-facing dashboard where we can just have that data out there for the public so that it's not a secret anymore and everyone can see the impact that the policy is having.
Wonderful. Well, okay, I want to shift gears one more time on you, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Executive Director, but you seem to be a good source of answers. So there's been questions coming up about training. So one is, I know you mentioned earlier that there had been earlier a training bulletin about foot pursuits before you all were engaged in this entire policy process. So what does the training look like for officers on this policy, and how do you all plan to do that? Or can you talk a little bit about how officers are trained on policies in general?
So about a year and a half ago, we did release a foot pursuit bulletin, and there was training conducted at that time. A number of the items that are in the draft policy or the interim policy that we have out there now come from that training bulletin. So things like supervisory responsibilities, things like how to deal with a partner and whether you should separate from your partner or not. Obviously, the balancing test that both the superintendent and Lieutenant Kapistanik referred to. So these are concepts that should not be brand new to officers. In addition to that training bulletin, we are currently going through what we call e-learning, which is essentially officers log into a computer, they get some instruction on the policy itself, and then they have to take an assessment after that self-guided tour through the policy itself. That is taking place between now and June 11th, which is the date that the policy, the temporary policy, becomes effective. But moving forward, when we get to September and we have changes in that policy, we will have to do something similar in terms of an e-learning to let officers know what the changes are. But the final point I would make is beginning this year, for the first time, CPD has 40 hours of required annual in-service training, meaning every sworn member of the department is required to go to training every year. We have ramped up to 40 hours of required training. And moving forward in the years ahead, because foot pursuits are obviously, as we've mentioned here, a major safety concern, that will have to be incorporated into our annual training as well.
All right, thank you so much for that. Additional question, again, in a different category here. Since this is policy or will be policy, right now it's an interim policy, but once it becomes final policy, what type of accountability will officers have, or what type of discipline if the officers don't follow this policy as written? What's a possible outcome for an officer?
Lieutenant, I would ask you to chime in here, but there are general orders that deal with officers needing to adhere to orders that come out from the department. So in other words, we have an order that says that all members must abide by the department directives. And so anytime there is a new directive that comes out, obviously that overarching disciplinary order applies. So while I can't tell you exactly what the discipline will be, because obviously it will depend on the nature of the incident, nature of the infraction, if you will, all policy comes with the weight of potential discipline. That's the main difference between a training bulletin, which has no disciplinary ramifications, and a policy, which does have ramifications. So that is really the main difference here.
Thank you. Lieutenant, did you want to jump in or not? If not, I'm going to continue forward.
Yeah, absolutely. The executive director has it right, and that's the focus on the policy and officers adhering to it. But I know in the chat also people were asking about what if officers don't engage in a foot pursuit. And to the earlier question on some of the feedback we've received from the community and some of the feedback we received from our officers, there is language in the interim policy that provides that if an officer weighs the risks with the need to apprehend that subject immediately, and they determine the risk outweighs that need, and they don't engage in a foot pursuit based on that balancing test, they will not be disciplined solely for that. That's language consistent with other best practices with other agencies. It was a specific comment from the community groups, from some of our officer focus groups. But to the superintendent and executive director's point, just because an officer doesn't engage in a foot pursuit doesn't mean police action isn't appropriate, whether it's the tactical apprehension or technological apprehension, whether it's containment, whether it's a notification to other officers. We're still requiring officers to follow their training and still take police action, but if they specifically perform that balancing test and determine that risk just is too great to engage in a foot pursuit, they will not be disciplined solely on that point.
Thank you. One of the questions that's also been raised is, as a department, do you feel like there's opportunities to have a better relationship with the community, I guess allowing for less negative interactions in general and less of a need for foot pursuits? Do you think that there's opportunities for CPD to do more community engagement and community outreach that would maybe minimize the necessity for this?
100% yes. This process is an attempt to be more transparent, to open the books, if you will, and really allow community members into the policy-making process so that we have a policy ultimately that's reflective of the views of the city of Chicago. But in addition to that, and Commander Navalis can speak to this better than I can. I've seen a number of comments in the chat tonight about community policing. That is absolutely something that is a focus of the superintendent and of Commander Navalis, who's in charge of our community policing efforts. And we really are trying to make a shift where our department is more problem-solving focused. So in other words, shifting away from expecting the community to come to us, and for the department to be far more proactive in reaching out to the community and going to where the community is, identifying the persistent problems, and most importantly, doing everything we can to bring resources to bear to solve some of those persistent problems. So that is part of the shift that we are going through here in the department. And so I think it's reflective of the fact that we're being open and transparent about the development of the policy, as well as in how we're hoping to change those day-to-day interactions on the street.
Thank you so much, Executive Director. I'm going to try to highlight some of these dates and some of the things that are upcoming for our community. We want to say, one, that we know that you've got everyone out there who's watching and engaging with us on this webinar live today. We really appreciate your time and your energy and all of your thought-provoking questions. You've given me a lot of material to work with as a moderator, so thank you so much for sending those questions in. But we know there are other questions out there. So one, you can send those questions in. We are going to try to keep track of the questions that have come through the chat that we were unable to answer during the 1 hour that was allotted for this webinar. But you can also, as the Executive Director said, you can also send your questions and comments to community@chicagopolice.org. That was the email address that Commander Navalis mentioned earlier. I want to mention again that July 15th is the deadline for most of our community outreach and engagement, unless something changes. You can always check the Chicago Reform site to see where we're at in our community engagement, and also find out how you can get involved with our community engagement processes. There are 2 community engagement conversations coming up beyond this one on June 30th at 7 p.m., one on July 10th at 12 p.m. Again, they are mentioned on the Get Involved website. You can also fill out that input form to give your written feedback. And then there will be those deliberative dialogues, which I believe one of the questions was about how many community organizations and how they be selected. It is on a first come, first served basis. So if you're interested in having a private dialogue with CPD around foot pursuits policy, please do get on that webpage and sign up so that they can have those engaged conversations with you. The police department has partnered with the community organization of trained facilitators to have those small conversations with community-based organizations and collect that feedback. Aside from that, we will be also posting, when I say we, CPD, will be posting a frequently asked questions page after today's webinar based on the themes that are developed from the questions that weren't able to be answered, as well as any other questions that may have come in during this webinar. So please be on the lookout for that. They will try their best to answer most questions in a thematic way so that not every individual question will be answered, but the themes that have been identified will be answered through the FAQ, and then also through the input forms. They will be collecting your feedback. So we want to thank you for participating in this evening's first ever CPD community conversation via webinar. And we want to encourage you to get involved, as they say on the website, and stay involved and continue this conversation. I want to say thank you to CPD for inviting me to be the moderator, and for also being involved in ongoing engagement with the community and ongoing ways to bring the community's voice to the table. With that, I will say good night, and thank you all so much for your time, for your energy, and for your efforts to make CPD in Chicago a better place for everyone. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.